Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always up for a journey into the depths of history.
Well, today we're headed to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, early 2000s.
Baton Rouge. I'm sensing a story with a dark twist.
You got that right. We're talking about not one, but two serial killers operating at the same time.
Now that's a recipe for a chilling deep dive. What kind of sources are we working with on this one?
We've got a good mix. Police reports, court documents, even some snippets from a true crime podcast should give us a pretty good picture of what went down.
Sounds like a fascinating puzzle waiting to be pieced together.
Exactly. And the real mission here is to explore how the case unfolded, how the authorities eventually caught both killers.
Especially considering they were operating concurrently. It must have been a confusing and terrifying time for the people of Baton Rouge.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine living in a city knowing there's not just one, but two predators out there.
So, to kick things off, let's set the scene. Baton Rouge, early 2000s. The city is living under this cloud of fear. Unsolved murders, mostly women, stretching back over a decade. A decade of unsolved murders? That's a long time for a community to live in fear.
It is. The earliest case we have takes us back to 1994. The murder of Ann Bryan,
Ann Bryan.
an 81-year-old retiree. Someone broke into her apartment at a retirement home and stabbed her to death.
A retirement home, that's particularly disturbing, targeting someone so vulnerable.
It is. And sadly, the case went cold, leaving everyone on edge. But it gets worse. 5 years later, in 1999, the body of Catherine Hall was discovered.
Catherine Hall?
Yeah, she was 29 years old, working as a sex worker. And her murder was brutal. Naked, strangled, post-mortem cuts on her body. Oh, and get this, she was found beneath a dead-end sign.
A dead-end sign. That could be significant, almost like a message, a taunt from the killer.
It's a chilling detail for sure. And unfortunately, Catherine's case, like many involving sex workers, didn't get the attention it deserved. From the media, from the police.
Yes.
It's a sad truth, you know. Certain groups get marginalized, their cases don't get pursued as vigorously.
It's a societal issue for sure. The perception of certain groups influences how their cases are handled. But every victim deserves justice. Every case deserves a thorough investigation.
Couldn't agree more. But the case that really shook Baton Rouge to its core, the one that really shattered the illusion of safety, was the murder of Hardy Schmidt.
Hardy Schmidt.
Yeah, happened in the spring of 1999. Hardy was the wife of a local attorney. So this murder, it really hit home for a lot of people. She was out for her morning jog when a man hit her with his car, forced her into his vehicle, drove her to a park, raped her, and then strangled her with a zip tie, dumped her body miles away.
A zip tie, that's a very specific detail, and disturbingly methodical. Premeditated, perhaps.
Turns out, yeah. The killer had been stalking Hardy for weeks, planning his attack. It sends shivers down your spine just thinking about it. But tragically, the violence didn't stop there.
There were more victims.
Over the next few years, several more women were murdered. Joyce Williams in 1999, Lillian Robinson in January of 2000, Marilyn Neville in October of 2000.
All with similar patterns.
Well, not all, but enough to create this sense of panic in the city. It felt like they were dealing with a monster they couldn't catch, and it was a monster. In 2003, they arrested Derek Todd Lee.
Derek Todd Lee, a known criminal.
He was a serial killer. And at first, there was this huge wave of relief, like, okay, it's finally over, we can breathe again.
I can only imagine. To finally have a face, a name to the fear.
But here's the twist. DNA evidence started to come back, and it showed that Lee was only responsible for some of the murders.
Hold on, so there was another killer out there.
Yep. Operating in the shadows all that time.
That must have been a devastating realization for everyone involved.
It was. The nightmare wasn't over. And just 5 months after Lee's arrest, they found the body of Johnny Mae Williams.
Johnny Mae Williams.
45 years old, mother of 3, also a sex worker. Her murder had some chilling similarities to some of the earlier victims. Strangled, hand severed post-mortem. It was horrific.
So the hunt for the second killer began.
Immediately. And they quickly found a link to the murder of Catherine Hall back in 1999. Both women had marks suggesting they were strangled with a ligature.
A ligature.
Basically, anything used for tying or binding, a rope, cord, maybe even a zip tie in this case.
Ah, right. So that detail starts to connect the dots.
Exactly. And there's more. They found a hair on both Catherine and Johnny Mae's bodies. Didn't belong to either of them.
DNA evidence.
They were able to test it, yeah. And that's when things got really interesting. They got a break in the case, but not from DNA. Came from a tire track.
A tire track? How on earth?
Right. It seems so random. But this particular tire track led them to a local car dealership. And get this, they were able to match it to a specific tire, the Goodyear Equitrid 3.
That's incredible. Talk about attention to detail. So they had a tire model. What then?
Well, they tracked down everyone in the Baton Rouge area who had purchased those tires.
Must have been quite a list.
Over 100 people. Talk about a needle in a haystack. But they started investigating each person on that list, determined to find their guy.
The pressure must have been immense, knowing that a killer was still out there.
Oh, absolutely. And as they worked through the list, they came across this father and son duo who seemed really suspicious. Not only did they own those Equatrid 3 tires, but they admitted to knowing one of the victims. And get this, they found the victim's purse at their house.
Sounds like an open and shut case.
You'd think so, right? But luckily, they had DNA evidence. And it cleared the father and son. It just goes to show how important forensic science is. The wrong people could have easily been blamed.
Absolutely. DNA evidence has revolutionized criminal justice. So, back to square one.
Pretty much. But they kept digging. And then Detective Todd Morris, he caught a break during an interview. One of the suspects, Sean and Vincent Gillis, he slipped up, said something that placed him at one of the crime scenes.
A slip of the tongue, that's often all it takes.
It was. They ran his DNA, and guess what? It was a match. They had their second butcher of the Bayou.
Finally. So what happened then? What did they find when they arrested him? I can only imagine what was going through their minds as they apprehended this guy. What did they find?
Let's just say his house was not what you'd call normal.
Oh, what do you mean?
It was like stepping into a horror movie. Knives, hacksaw blades, zip ties.
The same kind used on the victims.
The very same.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the worst of it. They found photos, videos of his victims.
He documented his crimes. Oh, that's chilling.
It gets worse. Gillis confessed later. He actually felt like he was in competition with Derek Todd Lee, the other serial killer.
A competition? Like, who could be the most prolific killer? That's a level of darkness I can hardly comprehend.
It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? But here's where things get a little, strange. Despite Gillis confessing to everything, his lawyers managed to get the confessions thrown out.
What? Thrown out? How is that possible?
Legal technicality. Something about how the confessions were obtained.
So he confessed, but they couldn't use it against him. The legal system can be so complex.
It is. But in the end, he still got 3 consecutive life sentences without parole.
So at least he was off the streets. No more victims.
Exactly. But it's still unsettling, to think that someone could commit such horrific acts.
It makes you question human nature, doesn't it? What leads someone down such a dark path?
It does. But for now, we're going to shift gears a bit. Leave Baton Rouge behind and travel back in time.
Back in time. Where are we headed?
Victorian England. 1879, to be precise.
Oh, Victorian England. Always a fascinating era. What's the case?
The story of Kate Webster, a maid who committed a murder that shocked Victorian society.
A maid. This I have to hear.
Oh, it's a story you won't forget. Picture this, if you will. London, 1879. Gas lamps, cobblestone streets, fog everywhere. And in the midst of it all, this sensational murder case unfolds. The case of Kate Webster.
It's amazing how certain cases capture the public's imagination, isn't it?
It really is. And this one was huge. Made headlines all over England. But before we get into the murder itself, let's talk about Kate. Born in Ireland in 1849. By all accounts, she had a bit of a troubled past.
Troubled how?
Well, even as a child, she was known for being a skilled thief. Pickpocketing, that sort of thing. Always in trouble with the law.
So, a bit of a rebellious streak from a young age.
You could say that. By her late teens, she had a string of convictions. And she wasn't just a thief, she was a liar, a manipulator. Very cunning.
Sounds like she was quite a character.
Oh, she was. So to escape her past, she ends up in London, trying to reinvent herself. Gets a job as a maid for this wealthy widow named Julia Martha Thomas.
A wealthy widow. Seems like an odd choice for someone trying to stay under the radar.
It does, doesn't it? But at first, it seemed like things were going okay. Julia needed a live-in maid. Kate needed a fresh start.
But it didn't last, I'm guessing.
It didn't. Their personalities clashed. Julia was a bit eccentric, quick to anger, and Kate, well, she wasn't exactly known for her patience.
So tensions were high?
Very high. And on February 28th, 1879, everything came to a head. Kate came home late from her day off, drunk. They got into a huge argument.
And I'm assuming this argument didn't end peacefully.
It didn't. In a fit of rage, Kate pushed Julia down the stairs.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. Julia died from the fall. And that's when things took a truly horrific turn.
What do you mean?
Instead of calling for help, Kate decided to cover up the murder.
How did she do that?
She dismembered Julia's body, boiled some of the remains on the stove, even burned some of the organs in the oven.
Oh, that's gruesome.
It gets worse. She packed Julia's remains into a box and disposed of them. Even sold the gold fillings from Julia's teeth.
Sold the gold fillings. That's cold-blooded.
It is. But eventually, Kate's luck ran out. She started selling Julia's belongings, claiming they were from a deceased aunt.
Not very bright, was she?
Not exactly. Neighbors got suspicious. A furniture broker found Julia's diary. The police got involved. It all unraveled pretty quickly.
So they found her.
She actually fled to Ireland, trying to disappear. But the authorities caught up with her, extradited her back to London to stand trial.
What happened at the trial?
It was a huge media event. The courtroom was packed. Everyone wanted to see the monster maid, as the newspapers called her.
Did she confess?
Nope. Pleaded not guilty. But the evidence was overwhelming. And there was this key witness, a young man who had helped her transport that box with Julia's remains. He saw her throw it into the River Thames.
That must have been damning testimony.
It was. The jury found her guilty. She was hanged at Wandsworth Prison in July of 1879.
What a story. From maid to murderer. It's a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface.
It is. And here's a final eerie twist to this tale. Over a century later, in 2007, they were doing some renovations on a property next to the pub where Kate had spent her last night of freedom. And guess what they found?
Don't tell me. Julia's remains.
A human skull. And forensic analysis confirmed it belonged to Julia Martha Thomas.
After all those years. Incredible. So there's a sense of resolution, I suppose.
In a way, yes. But it also reminds us that the past can come back to haunt us in unexpected ways. And that's what makes these cases so fascinating, so compelling. They force us to confront the darkness that exists in the world, and maybe even within ourselves.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. But it's also a reminder that we need to be vigilant, to pay attention to the details, and to never underestimate the power of even the smallest clue. Well, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with more stories from the annals of history. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.